I'll close with one humorous incident you'll enjoy. I was outraged when the Israelis invaded Lebanon. The 1954 Arms Control Act requires that if a country to whom the U.S. gives arms uses those arms to invade a foreign country, we must, by law, cut off arms assistance to that country. Remember when Turkey invaded Cyprus, we cut off aid to Turkey, a NATO ally, we cut them off. So when the Israelis invaded Lebanon and they started using U.S. cluster bombs, which they had been under a treaty, we gave them a cluster bomb after the '73 war, and we gave it to them on three conditions. One, it's a terrible weapon. It drops out of a plane at about 1,000 feet. This big napalm-type canister blows apart, and maybe 200 bombs float out and scatter over 25 acres, and they're timed to go off every 5 minutes. First group goes off on a contact, next 5 minutes. And when the planes are gone, these things are lying around, and troops know enough to stay away from, but little kids come out, or women pick them up and get their hand blown off. They're a terrible, devastating weapon, and we insisted by treaty in 1973 that they would use them only if they were invaded by the armies of more than one country. In other words, they had been invaded by two countries to use a cluster bomb. They'd never use them in cities, and they would never use them in partisan warfare against irregular units. Only against regular troops, only if they're invaded, never in civilian areas. Well, a guy named Nick Timish, who later died rather mysteriously, reported they were using cluster bombs, and he came into my office in Washington and gave me some cluster bomb fragments. And I said, they're using cluster bombs. The Israeli government immediately denied it. They sent a guy over to the Knesset to debate me. But somebody always leaks in this world, and the State Department guys knew they were losing cluster bombs, knew they were violating a treaty, and the State Department guys had tenure. The Israeli lobby couldn't get them out of their jobs. They could make it difficult for them. So they kept saying, you're right, McCloskey, keep saying it. So I'm issuing speeches on the use of cluster bombs. Finally, the Israelis admitted that they'd been lying, they violated the treaty, that they'd used the cluster bombs in southern Lebanon. Well, there was enough concern in the Congress that 6 of us went over in 1980, and we went to Syria, met with Assad, went to Jordan, met with the king, and then we went to Lebanon, met with the various Christian Maronites and the Shiites and the Druze. There's 4 participants in the government of Lebanon. Met with the Israelis. We had to stay up in the American residence because they'd blown up the embassy. And we went with Yasser Arafat in his bunker in West Beirut. I remember saying to the guy that was later killed, who was the president? He was a Maronite Christian. He was running for the presidency. This was in July. The Israeli bombs were strafing West Berlin. Or West Beirut. I asked him, how can you run for president? 1/6 of your country's down there in West Beirut getting bombed by the Israelis. Tanks, American bombs. And he said, that's not my problem, because to the Maronite Christian in Lebanon, the Muslims weren't really a problem. They were his problem. That was about 2 weeks before Shabra and Shatila, when the Israelis unleashed the militia into those camps and killed all the women and children. Well, anyway, after we had met with these various Arab leaders and went to Israel and Egypt, they put me up at the King David Hotel, the very hotel where Begin had blown it up at one time when they were fighting the British. And Tom Brokaw's show got on satellite television and said, would I go to the Israeli television and tell them what we were finding, talking to Assad, Hussein, Arafat. And I'll never forget it, because you get about a 5-minute soundbite, and Brokaw's in New York, and I'm in this Israeli television station up on a hilltop, and they say, what do you think of Begin? And I think, well, he's the same guy that hung the British soldiers back in the war. He was a terrorist, and even the Israelis thought Begin was a terrorist. I think they could call him the Jewish Hitler, I believe was the name they assigned to him. In any event, what do you think of Sharon? Well, he's a butcher, that guy. I mean, Sharon was a mean guy, and what was the third one? Shamir. Shamir was a little evil-looking guy. And so here I am over national television on Brokaw on NBC talking about the Israeli leaders, none of it complimentary. And Brokaw says, well, tell me, what do you think of Yasser Arafat? No, you quite met with Yasser Arafat at that time. I said, well, I think he's a man of peace. At that point, they shut off, the Israeli military center shut off the television program, broadcast the United States, and I'm walking out, I can hear the guy running the show, and he's arguing with the brigadier general of the military center. He said, "You can't shut off an American," speaking over an American audience, and the major general, or brigadier, he says, "We don't care what he says about our leaders. We probably agree with him. But nobody can say Yasser Arafat is not a terrorist on Israeli television." And that, of course, was the ADL position at the time, that Paul Finley lost his seat in Congress because he met with Yasser Arafat. Andy Young lost his seat at the UN because he had met with the PLO. So you've got this incredibly powerful organization. You remember, you all should have this tape if you don't, of that guy on the phone from New York to Washington. They're explaining how many people have been appointed from the ADL into the Clinton administration. It's enough to make you Republican. And that is true, incidentally. The Democrats are far more beholden to the Israeli lobby than Republicans. Republicans tend to get their money from big business, and that's sometimes corrupt, but you can't get elected in this state without the support of Jewish money if you're a Democrat and you want to be elected. Well, that power has, I think, reached its zenith. I hope you'll keep examining history. I've written 2 books on history. It's very difficult to get at the truth when you go to the original sources. I would caution you against one thing, a little that I hear today. A historian should be dispassionate. I use that word deliberately. Do not let the conduct of your enemies cause you to become less than dispassionate in your historical view. I hate to hear the word propaganda. I've heard it ever since I've been a young man. Your story is the truth. The enemy's story is propaganda. It's unseemly, in my judgment, to say that one point of view is propaganda. The great American Constitution was probably enacted because of an 82-year American named Ben Franklin. On the last day of the Constitutional Convention, they'd labored 4.5 months in a sealed room in Philadelphia. They'd come out with a Constitution. When people say you're too old to be in the Congress, you just remind them of Franklin's speech. He's 82. And he got up and he said, "Gentlemen," he said, "the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment, even on matters that I was once certain of, because when I received fuller information or new arguments, I found that I was often wrong in the opinions that I originally formed." A historian, ideally, should be like a juror in California. Every juror, before you're sworn, you have to advise the court that you will wait to hear all of the evidence on both sides of an issue before reaching a judgment of guilt or innocence or liability or non-liability. And I think to the historian particularly, dispassionate reporting of events. Because the other side say you're a kook or a screwball or a nut, don't be led into saying they're a vicious tool of the Israeli state. They may be, but the historian's words receive the credit of the community, maybe not at the first. Maybe you're reviled. The first guy that said something about being the Son of God, didn't they crucify him? I mean, the messenger is always shot. It's customary. The first person who spoke out against Vietnam War, most of my district thought I was a communist. I got away with it because I'd been a Marine in Korea. They couldn't really say a Marine was not patriotic. But if a college professor said he was against the war, I remember my colleagues in the Congress saying they're traitors. Well, the great source of inquiry ought to be the college campus, the minds of students with instructors that put both issues before them. When I was a freshman at Stanford, the rednecks and the right-wingers in Southern California wanted to get rid of a Stanford economic professor because he was a communist. He taught socialism, Ted Krebs. And everybody said, get rid of Krebs. How can young minds be exposed to this terrible man saying that there's something other than capitalism to look at as a goal? The man that is revered in the Marine Corps, Smedley Butler, fought in every island, Santo Domingo, Haiti, Nicaragua. Fought for 30 years. When he retired, they asked him, "Tell me about your career, General Butler." He said, "Well, you know, in my youth, I thought I was fighting for the freedom of the peasant and justice and dignity and truth for Latin Americans. I now realize that I was fighting for the Anaconda Copper and the United Fruit Companies." And that history, of course, in that time, if you had suggested that Marines were dying in Nicaragua or Haiti for United Fruit Company, you would have had the same public opinion turn against U.S. intervention in Latin America as you saw in Vietnam. You know what turned the Vietnam public opinion? Was Tet. Tet was a terrible defeat for the communist insurgency. Practically wiped out the Viet Cong. But Tet taught the American people that our government had been lying to us for over 4 years, that we weren't winning the war, that these people were not being wiped out, that they had the capacity to fight. And so when the people learn the truth, they turn against those that have been lying to them for these many years. And I think if the movement of which you people are the striking edge can retain dispassion in the face of these outrages, like being imprisoned in Germany for thinking, it's like going back to the Alien and Sedition Acts. That's what this country was formed to allow, is to allow people to criticize government, like John Peter Zenger. Only now you're criticizing worse than the government of the United States. You're threatening the security of the State of Israel that the Jewish community is dedicated to preserve and to destroy those who speak against it. Good luck.